yet, but welcome to anybody that's watching it later, and welcome to anybody that does show up here. This class is all about college newcomers. Welcome in. You, among many others, have decided to take residence here in this wonderful state, and are a lot of things about growing plants here or doing gardening, doing landscaping that is great to know just for your own benefit. And some of these things will actually extend into house plants, and a lot of it will just be extremely helpful in answering a lot of the questions that you may have, especially if you've been losing a bunch of plants in the past, inside, outside, what have you. So, to start, I would just like to say that Colorado is not an easy place to be growing things. In fact, here in the Front Range, Foss Creek Nurseries and Fort Collins up here, the entirety of the Front Range is not a forest. It has never been a forest. So, if there were no people in the Front Range here, I can guarantee you that you would not be seeing all these trees outside. You might have a couple near waterways, like your cottonwoods, peachleaf willow maybe, but on the Front Range, we don't really have a lot of native trees, which is one of the huge reasons why it can be very difficult to grow some of these things here. So, to start, just like I like to break things up in other classes, I would like to break down why being a Colorado newcomer and why growing here can end up being a little bit more difficult. So let's go ahead and start with sunlight. Sunlight here is much more intense than a lot of other places in the country. We are a lot higher in elevation, meaning that those UV rays are coming in much, much heavier and at a much higher frequency, meaning that you can get sunburn out here a lot quicker, and so can your plants. So can, a lot of those plants that you grow out in your landscape. So to start, that is always something that you want to keep in mind. In that same way, some plants can grow very well, especially those that have adapted to take the sunlight a little bit better, but it is a lot more intense sunlight and it is a lot higher UV. So keeping that in mind, we'll talk about different reasons why that affects us and how we can talk about it a little bit later, but just keep that in mind to start, that the sunlight is very intense here. Next, we have a very variable and a very bipolar environment here. It is really hard to determine when one season is ending and another one is beginning. It is extremely difficult to tell. So we have usually we'll have a last frost date that people will advertise or put out, but those should always be taken with a grain of salt because it may not always be accurate. And we may get a late freeze, we may get a late snow that is heavy, and that could cause problems. So what I would say here is don't always trust the weather. Do not always trust the weather. It can definitely backfire, especially if you're taking something that cannot handle those late freezes, or if something blooms early, those types of plants can end up suffering if we have a late freeze or have a problem like that. On top of that, our environment is also very windy here on the Front Range, and that is something that can dry out or desiccate a lot of the plants that we put out here. And we also do not get a lot of moisture. Most of the moisture that we have here in Colorado that we use to irrigate comes from the western slope. And couple decades ago, I believe back in the 70s, there was the Big Thompson project, which allowed a huge system of canals and waterways to distribute that water across Colorado. But the water that you have, that you use, is more than likely going to be coming from those areas. It is not going to be coming from, again, the Front Range. We don't receive a lot of water, and we don't receive consistent water. So knowing that our environment is also limited in that way is a good thing to know. And I'm going to go ahead and also say for the environment that generally, at least for plants, things are split up into zones. The lower the zone, the lower the environmental zone, the hardier those plants can be to a lower temperature. It doesn't necessarily mean that they can take more heat. That is a different zone. There's heat zones and there's environmental zones. Environmental zones are the kind of go-to that a lot of people will talk about first. Um, but yes, here on the Front Range, we are approximately a zone 5, I would say. If you are in a very exposed area out in the prairie or on some farmland, you're getting a lot of wind, you're getting a lot of cold, you may not be experiencing as high of a zone. It may be a little bit lower. And if you are in a very urban area, in a landscape that has a lot of blocks, either from trees or buildings, you may be developing a little microclimate, meaning that your zone can be elevated in just that one area. But for just to play it safe, I would say on average, most people that come to the nursery here, or most people that live around the Front Range, are more than likely a zone 5. Again, if you're on open area, you might end up being a high zone 4, but just something to keep in mind. It also has been getting warmer over the years, meaning that we're creeping closer to that zone 5 and even sometimes zone 6. So another thing to keep in mind there. And I would say lastly, with the environment, is you may be aware that we have a lot of hail here from time to time. We also may have really wet snows that dump all at once and then not receive any precipitation for a while after that. So those things are also good to keep in mind. But generally, in the spring, we will get most of our precipitation then into early summer. And as the summer progresses, we will get less and less. In the winter, it is kind of on and off. But we, to some degree, have a wet season and a dry season. Spring, early summer, and a little bit of late winter is kind of our wet season, and late summer, fall, and the beginning of winter is more of our dry season here, which is not great for a lot of the plants, especially newly planted flora out here. Now, we talked about the environment, we talked about the light. The last thing that is really important to know as a newcomer here in Colorado is our soil. Not only the soil, but the type that we have, the texture, and the chemistry of it. So to start, here in the Front Range of Colorado, and quite frankly a little bit beyond, we have very clay-heavy soils. And clay is the smallest of the 3 particles that generally make up soils, which are sand, silt, and of course clay. Those are the 3 that comprise the texture of any given soil anywhere. So here in the Front Range, as I mentioned, we have very clayey soils. Clay is the smallest particle out of sand, silt, and clay, and it also joins to itself very well. So that means a couple things. Clay is initially very hard to get wet. It is hard to take a big ball of clay or a big section of soil and wet the entire thing thoroughly. That is because that clay gets stuck together, and a lot of times it is not very porous, does not allow much air or water to fall through it, and on top of that, it can get compacted very easily. So if you have a very compacted and not very porous soil, it is hard to wet that soil. It is also very hard for a lot of microorganisms to live in there. It is not as bioactive as soils with more silt, sand, or organic matter in it. Now on top of this, it can be very hard to dig in these clay soils. It can also be very hard for plants to thrive as well, because not only, as we mentioned, that clay has a problem taking water, but it can also hold water for a very long period of time as well. So if you manage to wet an entire section of soil, it will stay wet for quite a bit of time. So the best way to combat this is, of course, to amend it, but that's something that I'll talk about here in a second. So we've gone through the texture of our soil being very clayey, hard to take water, but holds water for a very long time, easily compacted, which is not great for any air transfer between the environment and the soil. And also, it is not very high in organic matter, or is not as bioactive as some of the other soils you may experience in other parts of the country or other parts of the world. Now I'd like to talk a little bit more about the soil, specifically soil chemistry. Due to our clay soils here, they can end up being very high pH soils, very alkaline. And Once that starts to happen, some plants have adapted to alkaline soils and will thrive, do very well in those conditions, but there are a ton of plants that we use as landscape plants here that may not do as well. And more than likely, one of the big reasons for that is acidity. Like I mentioned, we have a very high pH. A lot of plants like maples or rhododendron or hydrangea, some of those really, really like more acidic soils. Specifically, the lack of iron is a big problem in our soils, and that's something I see every single year at the nursery and almost every single week. I swear, I have people coming in saying that their plant's dying, and you ask, okay, well, what's wrong with it? What are you noticing? Do you have a picture? And more than likely, it's a problem with iron, and the symptom of having an iron deficiency is that leaves will be completely yellow, except for the veins of those leaves, which will be completely green. If that has happened to you, more than likely on a maple tree, sometimes on oaks, but a lot of times it will happen on trees that have a very bright red fall color that are not native to the area. You will see, again, yellow leaves, green veins on those leaves. It means that that plant is iron deficient. So, why? Why is this plant iron deficient? Well, it is because iron is best absorbed and is most bioavailable, meaning it is best taken up by the plant at a more acidic pH. We're talking more of a 6 or maybe even like a 5. Here in Colorado, we have soils that have a pH of 8, if not more. So iron is not very available in our soils. It is in our soils. I would not say that it's not, but it's just not in a form that is available to the plant, which is important to know. So there are a couple ways to amend that as well, just like with the compacted soils, and that's exactly what I'm going to delve into next. Is now that we've talked about the light, we've talked about the environment, and we've talked about the soils, we can now talk a little bit about how to amend these problems and how to make plants as happy as they possibly can be here in the Front Range, here in Colorado. So let's start out with the light then. If you are a person that has a lot of indoor plants or a lot of house plants and you would like to bring them outside for the summer, or if you're someone that is starting seeds inside under a grow light and then is deciding to bring them outside and plant them in a garden bed or in your landscape, it is very important to know that if you just take a plant that's been inside or take a plant that's been in a shadier location, more than likely on an east or north side of your house, if you take one of those, throw it outside into a west or south facing area, or if it's inside, anywhere outside, you will more than likely experience burning on that plant. And that is just the same way that we get sunburned. They just have gotten so used to this artificial lighting, they've gotten so used to being inside in those environmental conditions that bringing them directly outside can cause a lot of stress, and it can overpower essentially the chlorophyll. Because chlorophyll is essentially what is causing photosynthesis. That is the process. That is the organ. That is the organ or tissue. I forget actually which. That is in the plant. That has the process of photosynthesis and is essentially feeding the plant itself. But sun is breaking down chlorophyll as fast as it is actually performing photosynthesis. So here in Colorado with those high UVs, it's burning it even more. And on top of that, the plant is not able to cool itself as fast because its roots have been growing at a certain pace that it's been used to inside. And again, taking that directly outside would be a massive change. I would say this is just like if you, like myself, were born and raised in some place that was very dark. I am from Fairbanks, Alaska. Shout out Alaska. If I were to be there in the winter, say around December 21st, I would only be experiencing about 2 to 3 hours of sunlight per day. That would be like me coming from there and going directly down to, say, the San Luis Valley here in Colorado in the middle of summer, and I would get sunburned immediately. My skin has just become so used to living in this darkness and not experiencing light at not only the same intensity, but at the same angle in the sky, because in the winter, you will have the sun at a much lower, more direct angle. So the sunlight is very intense, but it's not going to be providing as much of it. In the summer, that sun comes higher up into the sky. We get more daylight, and it is actually not as directly intense. But the heat definitely is. So, long story short, if you're bringing houseplants outside for the season, or if you're bringing seedlings outside, you may want to consider putting some shade cloth over them, or not only that, but taking plants outside for a couple hours per day, bringing them inside, bringing them outside to acclimate that plant to what it's going to be living in for the growing season. So definitely something to think about there. Now, after we've kind of figured out some of that light, we can talk a little bit more about the environment here. So for plants, the best time to plant is, I would say, going to be either spring or fall for a lot of the plants that we have outside here. But the truth is, you can really plant any time of year that you can get that shovel in the ground. I will say that I have had plants that I personally installed do very well if they're planted in spring or fall, and that is because they have the chance to root in, they have the chance to get acclimated in a less intense environment, instead of being planted midsummer where it is extremely hot, it is desiccatingly hot, and on top of that, well, the plants really aren't producing as many roots in the middle of summer. Plants really like to grow in stages. First thing that's going to happen if you put a plant into the soil, if you install a plant, it's going to try and develop a root system. It cannot push out any foliage on top unless it is given the correct amount of nutrients and is given a proper kind of housing for those roots. Now, if you buy very cheap plants or house plants, more than likely what's happened is they've been juiced with a ton of fertilizer, specifically with nitrogen in it, meaning that they've gotten a ton of leafy growth, but not a lot of root zone. So it'll take a long time to develop a correct root zone for those plants. But the environment here is suitable to giving these plants a good environment to actually establish themselves. So you want to make sure that when you do plant something, you are making sure that it has the correct amount of water and it has the correct amount of moisture pretty much all times of year. And that's another thing about the environment here is I say spring is one of the best times to plant because that is kind of during our wet season. We're getting more natural moisture that way, and you would not need to necessarily supplement a heck of a lot of moisture. Of course, every year is different. We might be experiencing more of a dry year, more of a wet year, and that could change. But essentially, if you take a tree, you plant it in spring here, you're allowing it to really break dormancy and start rooting when it naturally would do that, which is a great thing because that's exactly when plants are going to root, is the spring. They have more moisture, they're opening their buds, it's cooler out, they're not desiccating, so they can focus more on growing, and it has the entire season to develop those roots. You can plant early summer and midsummer. I've seen plants do just fine. I've seen more than enough thrive. Essentially, the only difference there is that you're just changing the time that the plant would normally be developing its root zone, which, I mean, like I said, you can plant any time of year. You just want to make sure that in midsummer, you're probably going to have to water a little bit more, and that's okay. But it's also important to know that when you do plant something, you want to make sure that you're allowing that root zone to dry out a little bit before you water again. If you consistently add water to the root zone, it's not going to grow much because you're just adding water right to it. And this is a very similar way that juicing plants with nitrogen to sell very cheap doesn't allow for a great root system because you're providing all the water right there. It's not giving the roots an opportunity to grow, spread out, and find new sources of water. So you want to make sure that you're, of course, doing that correctly. Allow those plants to dry out. Check the soil with your finger because a lot of times the environment here may not be enough to just let the plant grow. You may need to add supplemental water, of course, depending on the year. In the summer, it's very hot here. I mean, we get 90 to 100 degree days. It's gonna be a challenge. If we have those hot days, you might just want to water that plant a little bit just to make sure that it has enough moisture. If that root zone's already wet, Don't give it any more water. It's not going to help. It's only going to make it worse. But if that root zone's dry and it's a super hot day, you need to water that thing. It has to be able to cool itself. And that's exactly how it does it, taking in water through the roots and up to the leaves. In the winter here, it can be very, very dry and windy, which is a perfect storm for drying out or desiccating that plant. So a very important thing to do in the winter is to winter water, which is something that I hand out to everybody that buys a tree here, because that is where I get the most warranties on plants, is people do not winter water. I cannot stress how important this is, especially for plants like spruce or maples, things that are used to more temperate climates and more of consistent moisture. Things like pines or some of our natives, goodness, what's a good deciduous option there? Let's say a Kentucky coffee tree or some of the scrub oak. Those are more used to and acclimated for a drier climate, so they may not need as much water in the winter, but plants need water in the winter. And I will say that a bunch more times because it is that important. Generally, we suggest watering plants about once a month during the winter. And you could do that in a couple different ways. You could bring a watering can out there. You don't need to bring a couple. You can bring a big 5-gallon Lowe's Home Depot bucket up there, fill it up with water, get that root zone wet. If it's a warm day and you could turn on the hose, bring the hose out there and water that plant. But it is extremely important that we need to have moisture in the winter. Or else what will happen is that root zone will dry out, and once that happens, if it's warm, it's okay, but once it freezes after that drying out, the roots now have nothing to protect them. There's no layer of ice insulating. There is no layer of ice that is, as it becomes ice, is exothermic and letting off heat. And there is nothing keeping those roots moist, which they need to be. So, winter water, please, is what I would say. And I'd love to go a little bit more into that as well. But that is going through the seasons, exactly what you should be doing. And if anybody has any questions about that, feel free to enter them in at any time, and I could talk much more about that. But that kind of covers a little bit of the plants and the environment on how to keep them happy. Now, finally, we'll talk about plants and the soil, how to keep that soil happy and ready to receive plants and let plants thrive. So, as mentioned earlier in this little class lecture thing, it kind of feels more like a lecture, but, I don't want to call it that. It's fun. So, we have very clayey soils. The clay is not porous. It compacts very easily. It is not easy to wet, but when it is wet, holds water, and it also has a very high pH. That's a recipe for a problem sometimes. Now, there's a couple ways to get around this. If you didn't like winter water plants you bring into the garage, absolutely. By the way, I got a question on one of my formats here. And they asked, winter water plants that you bring into the garage, and I would say absolutely. That is a great idea, especially if that garage is experiencing below freezing temperatures. It is important to make sure that they are winter watered. If it's a more heated garage, then I would suggest watering it when you put it in there. But if it's a bulb or some other type of dormant plant, it may not be necessary, because if that root zone is dry and not frozen, it still is going to desiccate. I would suggest not letting it dry out completely, but you don't have as much danger of truly killing the plant. So I would say yes with a couple of those conditions. And we are about to talk about amending the soil here in just 1 second, and I hope I answer your question. If I do not, please feel free to ask me something else. I would water those plants in your garage when you can stick a finger fully into the soil and you feel it dry up. I would not let it get to the point where the plant is completely compressed in on itself and has completely left the sides of the pot. But I would water when you could stick that finger in the soil and you feel it essentially dry up. Water it once you put it into the garage, and then it will be approximately, I would check it every 2 weeks to a month to see if it's super dried out. but not completely, is what I would say. Now we're talking about the soil. The clay, compacted, and does not allow airflow, is not porous, and has a very high pH. So, to start, it is very difficult to dig holes when the ground is sopping wet. It is, had to turn this video back on here. It reached its recording time limit, and I just turned it back on. But it's very difficult to dig a hole when it's sopping wet. Very difficult. Not only are you losing the shape of what you're trying to get, but it's also very hard to not have that clay fall apart on you. It may clump very heavily, and may not be the best. So you want to wait until that soil is not necessarily sopping wet. It can be moist or it can be dry. Those are both good times to start amending it. But the best way to amend the soil here is going to be to add compost to it. Compost is going to add organic matter into the clay soil, which I had mentioned earlier is something that is a big problem here. We don't necessarily have a lot of organic matter, and that is because we don't really live in that forest. Like I mentioned, if there were no people here, there wouldn't really be any trees. So nothing is dying, nothing's decaying, nothing be broken down. So adding compost to the clay soils allows the addition of organic matter and allows some of that clay to start getting broken up and microorganisms start doing their thing. Now, once you've amended the soil with clay, once you've amended the clay soil with compost, now is a great time to start planting some of those guys. You do not want to amend too much to the soil here. In fact, a lot of people in recent years have stopped amending their soil completely, which I can get on board with some of that, but I prefer to add a little bit more organic matter to start just to give my plant a real kind of boost here. So we generally suggest here at the nursery to amend the soil to a third of what you dig out of the hole. Once you dig that hole out, add compost, which should be approximately a third about what you dug out, and mix that in to the other 2/3 of what you just dug out of the hole. Now once you have that evenly mixed, you can plant the plant that you're putting in there and fill in that soil. You can lightly compact it, but again, remember our clay soils can be compacted very easily, so I would not do that very often. Now that kind of takes care of the texture of the soil. Oh, one more thing about that. If I'm saying you should only do a third compost because the plant has to acclimate to the clay soil. Eventually, once it roots out of that nice amended soil that you've given it, it's going to have to root into clay. So if the majority of what you amended is clay, then the plant can get used to that kind of environment as it continues to grow. I'm going to move on to soil chemistry and how we can amend that, and then I'm going to answer this question right here about watering perennials. So, for amending our very high pH, you want to use acidifiers, things or elements, nutrients that can actively help acidify the soil around them. Now, some of the classic ones are going to be sulfur. Magnesium is also a great one, but sulfur is the one that I usually and highly suggest. This usually comes in a kind of either powder or a pellet that can be broken down slowly, which is great because if you use a liquid, it leaches very fast and is gone very fast. But solids or, like I mentioned, pellets or powders, they take longer to break down and can be used over the course of a longer period of time. Now, that is something that you can buy and plant with your tree or shrub or perennial or annual, or it's something that you can mend the top of the soil with, and then finally some people will dig holes around that root zone and try to amend the soil in those specific areas. For example, if I have a maple that has that iron chlorosis, remember the yellow leaf with the green veins, if it has something like that, and then what I usually suggest for people is early on in the season around the drip line is where I would either drill holes or lay down some sulfur, allow that to leach into the soil right there where the newest roots are going to be, and allow the iron in that general area to become more bioavailable due to the addition of the sulfur. The other option is purchasing soil acidifiers that are in a liquid form. I have some over there that I could show you, but don't really want to get up at the moment. Just kind of want to finish this all, kind of finish out here if anybody has any more questions. But soil acidifiers are generally more of a liquid, which is something that you would mix in with your with water and drench onto the root zone of whatever plant you're trying to help boost the pH of. So after that, you can pretty much consistently count on adding sulfur or adding soil acidifiers. If you have a hydrangea that you want to be blue, sulfur. If you have a maple that is having chlorosis, sulfur, soil acidifier. And the issue is these things will not last in the, thank you very much, Liz. Liz, who is terrific in helping me out with all of this because I wouldn't know how to on my own, just brought me soil acidifier. Here it is, plus iron. Look at that. Ain't that wonderful? And it's got a picture of a rhododendron bloom on it, which is one of the ones I mentioned loves the acidity. So again, that is something that you would mix in with water. It has zinc, it has copper, it has sulfur, and it has magnesium in it, as well as that iron, all these compounds and elements that help making things more acidic. And if somebody wanted to ask a little bit more about maples at some point, or if you came in, had any questions, feel free to call. More than happy to talk about that for a long period of time, but I want to get to this question that was asked here a little bit ago. I apologize for taking a long time to do that. This question asks, should we start watering our perennials regularly now? And I would say, unlike you probably are looking for, it definitely depends. If your perennials are starting to break dormancy and you're noticing that the area that they're in is starting to dry out, then yes, I would absolutely start watering those perennials. If you have a perennial that's on a south or west side at the moment, and we're going to be experiencing some warm days here, I would suggest watering that, especially if it's drying out. But again, the best way to check, just like when I was talking about earlier, is to stick your finger into the soil. Stick your finger into the soil. If it feels dry, water it. If it feels wet, leave it alone. That is the best advice I could give you for any outside, any indoor plant. If it's dry, feels dry, stick your finger in. Feels dry, don't water. If it's wet, leave it alone. Wait, no. If it feels dry, water. If it feels wet, don't. I'm going to stop mentioning that before I talk myself into a loop again. So, if you have your perennial on a east or north side and it's not breaking dormancy, there's still a little bit of snow there, or there's still, or if there's still, snow around, then you would not need to do that. But that goes into the winter watering we talked about a little bit earlier, in which I would say approximately once a month, water those plants, and if it's starting to dry out, start to break dormancy, absolutely give it a water. So thank you for asking that question. I got a couple more over here. And this question says, is the liquid soil acidifier as effective as deep root feeding? And that is a great question. A lot of times these things can go hand in hand. You can actually add acidic compounds, sulfurs, or liquids to your already in use deep root feeder and directly put that compound right next to the roots. Roots do not go very deep. Roots like to go wide, especially tree roots and shrub roots. Anything woody likes to go much wider rather than deeper. You're not going to have roots getting down 6+ feet deep unless it's a massive plant. So the deep root feeding would essentially just take all of the nutrient, the soil acidification, either sulfur or liquid, that you would have just put right on top and hoped to leach deep enough. The deep root feeding would just press through, say if you have turf, it would press through all of that so it doesn't get taken up and essentially allow those roots to take in what you're providing it right at the source. So I would say it is as effective if you're using it with a deep root feeder, but if you are just fertilizing, then it has a different effect. Fertilizer is not going to affect the pH of your soil much unless it has something in it that does. So I would say no, it is not as effective as deep root feeding in that way, but you can put soil acidifying compounds, fertilizers, if it has sulfur or magnesium in it, or add something like this to your already in use deep root feeder, and that would apply to maples as well. I think I pretty much went through the main three things. Again, the light, the environment, and the soil, both here in Colorado, and how to amend those here today. Does anybody else have any more questions about either the light, the environment, or the soil, any specific plants that they're growing, any suggestions for plants that may not need amendment? Feel free to add those in now. And if you have any questions, always feel free to call the nursery. We'd be more than happy to help you out, or we can even set up another class if we get enough of the same questions. So I'll wait here a second for anybody to add any questions that they have, and I think I'll be about done. Thank you, by the way, to anybody who has asked any questions, specifically Marilyn here and Posh Ginger Cat Lady. That's awesome. I love that. Great. Soil testing is a good idea, right? Yes, soil testing can be a very good idea. CSU has a very great soil testing facility in which, for a small price, they will give you a little cup, it's kind of this test tube, that you fill up with a core of whatever soil you're trying to test and send it in. I would say there's a couple caveats of that. If you're not buying property to make money off that land for growing something, if it's just your backyard and your plants are doing well, I would not say a soil test is necessary, because whatever is going on is great for you. There's a couple really important things that soil tests can tell you. I would say the most important thing that soil tests are going to tell you is going to be the EC of your soil, the electroconductivity of that soil, which can essentially tell you how much salts are in there. I'm not talking just sodium, I'm talking salts in general. The more salts you have, there's a certain point where it may start to affect your plants. So if you're just someone at home who just likes to garden and you've noticed that the plants that are already there are doing well, then I would not say that a soil test is necessary. If you're genuinely curious, or something's not growing as well as you'd like, or you've noticed that a certain area of your property is not doing well, then absolutely, soil tests would be great, and they do a great job. But if things are, oh, did one for your lawn mostly. Okay, well, that's great. And a lot of times turf, especially if you're laying new turf down in a new development, it will be good to do a soil test just to figure out what's going on. So, but yeah, I mean, it can be a great idea, but if things are going well and you're not trying to, again, make a lot of money off the land in growing something, then it's not 100% necessary. Got one more question over here. Are you getting Kingsley's Ghost honeysuckle in this spring? Sorry for a random question. Hey, Dan. Are we getting Kingsley's Ghost honeysuckle in? Do you know if we have any at the moment? I'm checking on that. I'm checking on that right now. I mean, we have in the past. What I'll say is that we have in the past. Actually, every year that I've been here, we have had the Kingsley's Ghost. So, more than likely, yes. And this morning, I was helping a couple of my employees pull some of those out of one of the hoop houses that we've had. So, yes, we will be receiving honeysuckle, and I can double check on that Kingsley's Ghost for you. If you want to call the store here in like 5 minutes, I can tell you exactly what we're going to be getting. But I would say more than likely, yes. Okay. Well, I'm sorry that you missed the Kingsley's Ghost. Like I said, give the nursery a call in a couple minutes, and I'm beautiful. I have. It looks like, according to the system, I should have about 6 of those at the moment. Any other questions that we have at the moment here? Do you recommend aerating your lawn? Of course I do. That is a terrific idea. A lot of places will do it every year. Again, residential, you may not have to, especially if it's a newly established lawn. It becomes more of a pressing issue as lawns mature. You want to aerate more frequently. But I absolutely suggest aerating your lawn. And that has to do, again, with what we talked about in class today, those clay soils. They don't take water very well, and once they do, they hold it, and they can also compact it. They can compact it a lot. So if you're someone who has children, or you're always out on the lawn playing lawn games, or doing lawn stuff, if you're out on your lawn a lot and you're compacting that soil, absolutely aeration is a great idea. If it's a very high trafficked area, you could do it every year. If it's a newly sodded or newly seeded lawn, you may not need to for a couple years, but absolutely, thank you for asking, Cindy. That is a terrific idea to aerate your lawn. And thank you again, Marilyn, for asking more questions there. And the posh ginger cat lady, I love it. So, any more questions I can answer while I'm still here, guys? Everybody, I should say. Just give it another minute here, and I think I'll be just about ready to head off. Little product placement for the end here. All right, great. Well, I loved having this class. It's something I feel very strongly about because you may tell because it's been longer than all the other classes. So thank you, everybody, for being here. It's been a pleasure as always, and I hope everybody has a wonderful day. See you next time.